continue on now with Revelation chapter 18, verse 11. And hopefully, time permitting, we'll be able to wrap up Revelation chapter 18 in this study. Let me go ahead and begin reading. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, and of pearls, fine linen, purple and silk and scarlet, and all fine wood, and all manner of vessels of ivory, and all manner of vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble, and cinnamon, and odors, and ointments, and frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts, and sheep, and horses, and chariots, and slaves, and souls of men. So when we went ahead and wrapped up in the last study, completing at verse 10, we had noticed that the kings of the earth were mourning now, and that they were in pornuo with her. In other words, there was this intimacy of relationship where they had gained the benefit of being in relationship with her, experiencing the things that she experienced and enjoyed that type of fellowship, if you will, that communion, that a joining of mindset and pleasure with her. Here, we're having a conversation with regards now to the merchants who gained the benefit of everything that she desired. Remember, she was very wanton. She wanted all of her appetites fulfilled. And because she did, she was constantly seeking out things that would bring pleasure unto her. Paul makes the statement to Timothy. He says that in the last days that people would be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. She looked at herself as a queen and am no widow, as she had stated. And so she would seek those things that would bring her joy or peace or pleasure or whatever her fleshly desires were. And the kings of the world were enjoined to her for that same goal. The merchants here, though, are going to be weeping along with the kings, but for a different reason. Their pockets were no longer going to be filled with the cash that would result from all of the sales that went to her. There's something I want to point out at this juncture as well. We went through the period of judgments where we went through the seven seal judgments, the seven trumpet judgments, and then the seven bowls of wrath being poured out. And so we are coming to this tail end of the tribulation period where she needs to be moved out of the way so all attention will be placed upon the one world leader. And this period of time is very short. Based upon where we are at in the book of Revelation going into 19, Jesus' return is looming. And so there isn't really going to be a whole lot going on with regards to the activity of the one world leader. But in the midst of all of these judgments that are occurring, there is still activity taking place on the earth, activity that would be considered commonplace. If you'll remember going back to the Gospels, Jesus made the point. He says, just as it was in the days of Noah, where people were marrying and being given in marriage, which is an expression towards the commonality of life. People were getting married and being given in marriage. It was the ongoing cycle of the human experience. Just like it was in those days, so shall it be at the return of the Son of Man. And so even in the midst of all of the judgments that had been poured upon the earth and the wrath that had come through, there are going to be individuals who have hardened their heart, and whether they're just completely blaspheming God and looking against him, or just wanting to hear the most recent news headline about how all of this is just associated to global warming, that there's going to be a portion of life that's going to seem as if it is just continuing on for those who are completely devoid of any knowledge and desire of knowledge for God. And so here, as things begin to crumble, you see these merchants, and they are in tears as a result of the fact that this city is now destroyed, and it is destroyed by God. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things that are outlined here. The merchants are going to mourn over her, and as you see the product list of everything that is brought to her, it is actually broken down into different categories. It's not defined as such, but you can see it the way that it is written out. If you'll take a look at it, it says the merchandise of gold, silver, precious stones, and of pearls has to do with, of course, all of those things that we would associate to jewelry, if you will, or people of great wealth would afford these types of things. Let's continue on. You'll notice that the second is of fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, and that all encompasses everything that would have to do with clothing. Let's continue to move forward with this, and it says of Thyan wood, and all manner of vessels of ivory, and all manner of vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble. So now we're talking about components to a building, if you will, and things having to do with the structure or the day-by-day usage, such as utensils, even around a table. They're moving into that direction, and then we move on to the next group of items, and that would be that they are focusing on now with the cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense. And so now we're talking about things that have to do with fragrances associated to the body or to the room. Another aspect of pleasure. Each one of these is intended to the benefit of all of the senses, bringing to life all of the senses. And so let's continue on. And it says that the next group will be wine and oil, fine flour, and wheat. And so now we're starting to move in the direction of food as well, and agriculture. And then it moves into the beasts of the field, and the sheep and horses and chariots. And so if you'll notice, the horses, I believe belongs more towards to the distinction with the chariots, because it's now talking about mobility and the ability to move forward. These items that are listed here really focus their attention on individuals who would be able to afford all of these things. And so therefore it is given, if you will, as a shopping list for people who have a very, very large bank account. Now, what we're going to find interesting here is at the end of this it says, and slaves and souls of men. Slaves and souls of men. And one of the reasons why I find this so interesting is because of what the word slave is translated from in the original language. This word here in the Greek comes from the word summa. And the word summa in the Greek is always translated as body. Body or plural bodies. Summa, summa, summa. Throughout the New Testament, it is always translated as body or bodies. Here, it's being translated as slaves. And I struggle with that just a little bit. You see, if we were going to translate from a Greek word the word slave, a better translation or the better word to translate from would be the word doulos. And that is directly associated to either an under rower or a servant who is owned by a master. You can see this reference in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1. I don't think that John didn't know what word to use. I think when he used summa, I think he meant bodies and souls of men. Now, the reason that I think that it is being translated to to slaves here, at least in the King James Version, is because if we were to take a look at everything that is being listed, it is a list of things that can be bought and sold. And so therefore, when you throw bodies into the mix, you automatically think of slaves. Interesting statistic. Just under 50% of the nations of the world still allow slavery. It's something that is still allowed. And even in this country, as much as we have fought back from it, one of the things that they talk about with regards to our border issue, that of us being us and Mexico, is that when individuals are brought over, they are being trafficked. They are being brought over, whether it be for sex or whether it be for servitude. No matter what the situation is, there are people that are being brought over. And there are individuals in this country that strongly believe that there are very wealthy people who have still today slaves. That being said, the reality is that just under 50% of the nations of the world still count it legal. But one of the reasons that I have difficulty with this is that we are talking about bodies and souls of men, and you cannot own a soul of a person. It is something that belongs to each individual person. And let me explain further, and you'll get an understanding of why I'm heading in this direction, because I don't want to belabor this point, but I think that there is a reason why the word summa was being utilized here. And it says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus is speaking, and he says, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul." So in other words, there are individuals who have the capacity to be able to do something to your body. They could kill it, you could be arrested, you could be imprisoned, you could be tortured. All of these things could happen outside of your willingness for them to occur. But are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And so Jesus here is making that distinction with regards to our actions, our activities, and the fact that our body, even though it belongs to us, at times can be mistreated by other individuals, but our soul is always within our charge. Keep that in mind as I end up going back to Revelation chapter 18. But we're going to step into another passage of Scripture here, and we're going to go to Romans 6, picking up at verse 16, and it says this: "Know you not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey?" And that word servant there is doulos. To whom you give yourself as a servant to obey. His servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. Whoever you so choose to enslave yourself to is the one who is master over you. If it is sin, it'll be unto death. If it is in obedience to God, it'll be unto righteousness. Verse 17, "But God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed." Do you see what's taking place here? Paul is saying, you used to do that, and the decision was yours to do it, but now you have obeyed, and as a free moral agent, you've made the decision to do that. You have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants, the doulos, the slaves of righteousness. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as you have yielded your members servants, as you have yielded your members as servants, to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. For when you were the servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. What fruit had you then in those things whereof you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now being made free from sin and became servants, doulos, to God, you have your fruit unto holiness, and the end, everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Very popular verse that you likely have committed to memory, and if you haven't, then one that you are in many respects familiar with. Now, if you end up going back to Revelation chapter 18, and we were to pick up at the end of verse 13, and it says, and the slaves and the souls of men. You cannot sell the soul of an individual. So what do I think is being discussed here? It's having to do with the fact that these individuals not only may very well, if it's the bodies, be treated as slaves, but that we have allowed ourselves to be enslaved to a particular mindset, or that these individuals have allowed themselves to be enslaved into a particular mindset. And in so doing, they have sold their soul to that which they have committed their actions towards. And these merchants are individuals who have brought everybody in underneath these given umbrellas and are controlling them just as they are controlled by the wealth of the city of Babylon and her economic power. If you'll remember that word dunamis was given earlier with regards to her power and wantonness, her desire to draw, that the same thing exists there, that individuals have now committed themselves to these merchants in such a way that both body and souls are entrapped by this. Here's why I find this significant. And in our day and age, we are finding multiple examples of this being exercised. As an example, one of the headlines that has recently occurred was that Southwest Airlines wanted everybody to go and get vaxxed, and as a result, I think it was like 2,000 employees just walked. You see, because they work there, but Southwest Airlines doesn't own their soul. So they had the freedom to make a decision, and they departed as a result. In my own life, on 3 separate occasions that I can remember, I lost my employment because I would not compromise myself to what it is that the company wanted me to do, or to a behavioral pattern that they wanted me to display. It happens. If you'll remember Martin Luther, he's having a conversation at the Diet of Worms, where this is his famous statement that is being made, and he comes to the place where he says, to go against conscience is neither safe or right. It's not a good place to be. It's a dangerous place to be, to go against your own conscience. And so he says, so I cannot recant with regards to the things that I have written or said. He said, I can do no other. Here I stand. And at each of our lives, we are brought to a place where that is exactly what's going to have to happen. You will be brought to a place, whether it is on one level or another, where you're going to have to make a decision what it is that you stand for. And these individuals now have capitulated. They are part of the economic tapestry that exists, and they are sold into it, hook, line, and sinker, body and soul. Remember when God said his judgment was going to come forth, and it didn't even make a difference on whose mark, who the individual was who had to take the mark of the beast, whether they were rich or poor or bond or free, didn't make a difference. You are all having to make a decision. Jesus had to make that decision when he ended up running across Satan in the wilderness. He had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to follow what it is that Satan is telling me to do as he's sitting here and quoting scripture, telling Jesus how to behave? Or is he going to stand fast for what he knows is true? And these individuals have not. And in our day and age, we're finding out that there's a whole lot of people who won't and don't stand for what they know to be true. And burying your head in the sand is not going to make it all go away. So these individuals here, these merchants, are also involved in the bodies and souls of men. And by the way, if you were to go to Young's literal translation, Young's literal translation translates summa as bodies. Let's go ahead and go on, and I'll get off of that, but it's just some food for thought. Whenever I run across something like this, I always invest myself in it just a little bit more and start to look at these things and the distinction that exists. Nobody can take control of your soul. It is something that you have been made steward of, and the direction of it, whether it be for all eternity in hell or all eternity in God's presence in heaven, is a decision that is left to each individual person as to where that is going to end up. With that being said, let's go ahead and continue on. In verse 14, and the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more at all. The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her, shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. You see, she had everything that we were the ones that were bringing it, and she enjoyed it, and we enjoyed giving it to her, and there was a monetary gain as a result, and they're heartbroken over the fact that here were the things that were offered unto her, and now that is no longer going to exist. Well, as we approach Revelation chapter 19, this is not going to be the worst of it for these individuals, but as they're sitting there watching their meal ticket burned to the ground, now they're in a situation where they're just brokenhearted and just crying out with all emotion over the fact that this is gone from them. There's something else that's going to be popping up here that I want to point out that's going to come from the original language. And so in verse 17 we continue on. For in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city? Now, here's an interesting point with regards to the word city. Just as I was distinct in taking a look at the word summa and how it had been translated throughout the rest of the New Testament, well, this word city in the Greek, polis, is actually translated as city. It is a city, and it's not in reference to a nation where you would see that translated from either ethnos or genos, but it is here translated from the Greek word polis. And so it is not talking about an entire nation. It's talking about a city that had so much wealth and so much influence over the world that the devastation of this one city, which would have to be very, very large and very, very influential, was burned in one day. And this city is a consumer of much of the world's merchandise. There's an interesting thing that takes place if you evaluate how the world is set up on a table of nations. And that is this. The government, the federal government that exists, that oversees much of what happens within a given nation, or a dictatorship, or a monarchy, or however it is set up, is the one who determines what gets purchased from the world's market and is traded in and out of its borders. As an example, when a president goes into office in the United States, he can make a determination as to whether or not the items coming from another country are going to be heavily taxed, so that he influences their ability to be able to sell and compete within the borders of the United States. I'm using the United States merely as an example because of my familiarity with it, having been born and raised and live in the United States. But even though that is happening in essence in his position from a city, it can influence the consumables of an entire nation. So if this one city was to burn down, it's arguable that all of the agreements that that city, that governing power has with the rest of the world would come to naught as a result. And it would impact and devastate these economies significantly. It's something that you may want to just think about for just a moment, because that word city from the Greek, polis, means exactly that. It is a city, is a smaller geographical area than an entire nation. And so let's continue to move on as we move forward. In verse 19 it says, "And they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea, by reason of her costliness, for in 1 hour is she made desolate." They are now casting dust upon themselves. They are wailing as an individual who has lost a loved one. As was common within Middle Eastern culture and in Jewish tradition, that when something horrible happened, they would take dust, and as a sign of humility, they would throw it upon themselves as an expression of their mourning and their devastation in what would occur, or what has occurred, I should say. Let's continue on, and it says in verse 20, "Rejoice over her, you heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." Oh, so now we see the action of God as a kinsman redeemer. Remember that her cup was filled with the blood of the saints and the martyrs. This is going back now all the way to the Old Testament, and is defined here when it talks about the apostles and prophets. Whenever you see the emphasis of prophets in the New Testament, it is pointing back to those in the Old Testament who had actually stood up against her. One of the things I see identified within this is that there is a battle that exists between truth and what is a lie. And when you find yourself headlong in that battle, there is a good chance within the world structure that those who stand for truth were going to die as a result. But the significance of the apostles and the prophets is that except for John, all of the apostles died and were martyred. And as far as the Old Testament goes, many of them were martyred or were very, very, very ill-treated as a result. I mean, Daniel, there was an attempt upon his life as a result in being thrown into the lion's den. Jeremiah escaped death I don't know how many times. Jewish tradition says that there is a good chance that when a lot of the Jews after the Babylonian captivity had occurred, that many of the Jews ended up going down into Egypt because there really wasn't much left in Jerusalem and in the region of Judea, and that they had convinced Jeremiah to go down there, and Jeremiah continued to prophesy to them, and this is Jewish tradition, and that he was killed there. It is thought that Isaiah ended up being sawn in half when he ran into a hollowed out log escaping from Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, and that when they caught him, they cut the log in half with him in it. And that in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, when it says, "And some were sawn asunder," that it may very well have been pointing back to that experience. It was very, very common. But the interesting part about this is that every single time you ended up looking back, it may have been this king that did it, or that culture that did it, or those people who despised the person who was true or right or just and did it. But ultimately, God is saying, look, this all was handled under the hand, or under the deception, if you will, of Mystery Babylon the Great, of Semiramis. And God steps up now to avenge them as a result, as a kinsman redeemer, just as he had said in Revelation chapter 6, when they came, there was a large group that had been martyred that came out of the tribulation and ended up in heaven, and they says, avenge us. And he says, hey, just kind of hang out for a while, because there's another large group on its way, which we would have seen coming out of Revelation chapter 13. And he says, and I'm going to take care of it then. Then I've got a time frame in which I intend to avenge my loved ones, my servants, and it is going to happen on God's time frame. And when he does it, he will do it so devastatingly, completely, that he is now looking to the individuals and saying, rejoice over the fact that this has occurred. And I have done this for your sakes. Let's take a look at it again. Verse 20, rejoice over her, you heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Verse 21, and a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with violence shall the great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. So in other words, this is being given as a description, if you will. So it's not occurring. It's like an angel said, you want to know how bad she's going to be thrown down? Take a look at this big, huge millstone cast into the sea as a result, and devastated. What I find interesting with regards to this and the thought of the millstone, and oftentimes a millstone would weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,000 pounds. You see, the intent of a millstone was that it would be pulled around in a circular pattern as grain was fed into it, and the pressure that existed between the weight of the millstone and the stone that it was on would twist, and it would grind the grain, no matter what kind of grain it was, it would grind it to powder. And so Jesus makes this comment within the Gospels. He says, when he brings a child unto him, he goes, anyone who causes the least of these to stumble, it would be better for him to tie a millstone around his neck and be cast into the deepest part of the sea before he ends up doing something like that to one of these innocent ones. And now you have this angel casting this millstone going, oh yeah, whatever it is that she did is equivalent now in her devastation to having a millstone stuck or thrown into the ocean. Because if you ever thought that a millstone could float, that's just not going to happen. So let's continue on. Verse 21, and I'll read it again. And it says, and the mighty angel took a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in thee. And no craftsman of whatsoever craft he shall be, will be found any more in you. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard no more at all in you. And the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in you. And the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in you. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorceries were all nations deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. 2 points I want to make here, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up, and we will have now completed Revelation chapter 18. It says, and by your sorceries, by her sorceries, were the nations deceived. That word sorcery comes from the Greek word pharmakia, from where we get the word pharmacy from. It is a direct association to drugs or things that would influence, if you will, the mind, and to so do in such a manner as to be recognized as drunk or a hallucinogen or whatever, but it brings about deception. I remember years ago when I was in high school that, as you were getting to that age where you could drive and all this other kind of stuff, they showed you these films of people thinking that they were okay as they were getting more and more and more drunk, getting inebriated, and how they lost the ability to be able to fully comprehend what it was that was going on. And they were deceived into thinking that they were okay, that everything was all right. When I was in Las Vegas, I spent 2 years in a position as a facility manager for a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. And I want to be as kind as I possibly can be here, as well as being truthful. There is something that goes on within the mind even after they are able to detox you, where the thought processes of these individuals is warped. And it is amazing to see what they are capable of convincing themselves of once there has been a distortion of the thought process. It really is wild. And I'm not just talking about the individuals who came in who were on drugs or in a position of being an addict. I'm talking about the people who had come out of it and were now working for the facility. And I could give you horror story after horror story after horror story with regards to that. We'll just leave it at that. Drugs and alcohol lead to deception, ultimately. Convincing ourselves that we are okay when we are not. She has deceived the nations through her sorceries, through her pharmakia. Let's continue on with the last verse once again, and it says, "And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth." In other words, she had this within her possession, all of their blood, and therefore she was guilty. You could say in these terms something that we would be familiar with. The smoking gun was in her hand, and the dead body that she had shot was laying in front of her. She was guilty. And God said, "You're guilty. I have judged you as such, and you are going to experience my wrath for what you have done to my people." Always remember this, dear Christian, for whatever it is that you are going through, that whatever is happening to you is not just happening to you, but it is happening to you as a child of the living God. In Acts chapter 9, Paul is on the road to Damascus. We're familiar with the story. At least I think you may very well be, and if not, you can go back to Acts chapter 9 and read it. But Paul is on the road to Damascus. His intent now is that he is going to gather up Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem to be judged and chained up as a result. And as he is going now, he says, "A bright light flashed around me." Luke ends up writing the book of Acts, and he says, and everybody was fled, and he's sitting there now, and Jesus is saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" But Paul wasn't after Jesus. Jesus had already died, resurrected, and had ascended to heaven. But Jesus is saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" Why? Because if you're going after my people, if you're going after my bride, you're going after me. You men out there who are married, if somebody is coming after your wife, what is your attitude? And think of it in those terms with regards to God and what he is going to do for his children, whose blood is now strewn in the streets of the city of Babylon. He's going to bring forth judgment. And when he does, he is going to leave her completely destroyed with no trace of life left around and nothing that anybody would desire of her, to such a degree that the kings that were in relationship with her and the merchants who once were giving what they had to her or selling what they had to her are completely devastated by her complete and utter destruction. And that is what she gets to look forward to what we get to look forward to is going to start coming to light in Revelation chapter 19. And until then, God bless. Keep looking up. Maranatha. Our Lord will return, and we will see you soon.